Well, welcome everyone. Um, my name is Nauman Naqvi. I am the acting dean of the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the Habib University project in Karachi. Because he needs no introduction, that is Ashis Nandy, needs no introduction, it is my extraordinary privilege to introduce him. Because I myself have not been able to avail of many of his works here. I think he needs a somewhat proper introduction. Of course, it's impossible to do any justice to him in even a long period of time, but very briefly, as brief as I can be. And I'm not going to call him Professor Ashis Nandy because he has gone beyond any titles, right? Even though he is, of course, a professor and has more to profess than most professors put together. But the force, the singularity of his thought and his person is such that he has obliterated all the titles that he otherwise has. And these include disciplinary titles, right? So clinical psychologist, sociologist, that is really very banal for Ashis Nandy, since even before interdisciplinarity became something of a buzzword, his thought was forcefully transdisciplinary. And I will mention, though, his institutional affiliation. He is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. And the reason for this is because of his affection for his institution, his institutional home of several decades, of a few decades, and also because of the singular nature of that institution itself. The Center for the Study of Developing Societies stands out not just in our region for the extraordinarily original scholarship that it has produced throughout, but really in the post-colonial world at large, and has been very inspiring for many other institutional undertakings in the post-colonial world. And he has there also been a very significant director. The founding director was Rajni Kothari, but for many people from my generation, it's not Rajni Kothari that we identify with the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, but Ashis Nandy himself. I will also say, given our context here, that he is one of the greatest Gandhis of our age, Gandhians of our age, and his work is a living testament to the enormous critical potential and relevance of Gandhiji's legacy for the world that we inherit today. Let me also iterate some of his books to show the extraordinary range of his work, his curiosities, his concerns, his thought. I will do this by reading the contents of the 3 large omnibus volumes that Oxford University Press has been publishing recently. I will not mention the chronology of the works that are contained in those voluminous because he himself is not particularly fond of chronologies. They smack to him of progress and of history, and we'll talk a little bit about his critique of history and of progress. The first omnibus, called Exiled at Home, an exquisite title. You'll find in many of Ashis Nandy's works this exquisiteness of expression. Exiled at Home, which contains At the Edge of Psychology, The Intimate Enemy, Creating a Nationality. That's the first volume. Return from Exile, which contains Alternative Sciences, Illegitimacy of Nationalism, The Savage Freud, and most recently, the third omnibus volume, a very popular exile, The Tao of Cricket, because he's also a cricket commentator, An Ambiguous Journey to the City, Traditions, Tyranny, and Utopias. These titles by no means exhaust his oeuvre, and I would refer you to Google for a more exhaustive measure of his prolificness. But though he is prolific, he is not prolix. All his works are models of concision, the virtue we in Urdu call ikhtisar. He is a mukhtasir navis of the first order. All his works are very concise, and he doesn't waste words. He makes words glitter, right, with insight. Nevertheless, I will mention the resonant title of his most recent book, and he's promised me a copy. I haven't had the pleasure of reading it, but listen to another exquisite title. It says, Regimes of Narcissism, Regimes of Despair. And the blurb tells us that this is how he characterizes the structure of the Indian political culture today, that it is kind of torn or characterized by the coexistence of these two regimes. And I think it really resonates on a much larger scale, given the fact that neoliberal India, of course, is part of the neoliberal world in which we all live. Regimes of narcissism, regimes of despair. And they coexist both in the society as well as in each of us. In the course of his work, he has anticipated, as he invented for himself, new fields of inquiry, cultural studies and film studies. But I want to start with the text that really, for many of us, was a foundational, for many of people of my generation, was a foundational text amongst those foundational texts that taught us how to think, right? And how to gain a perspective on the enormously violent world, right? And the remarkable predicament that we had inherited, right, in the modern world, which is also, of course, the colonial world. They coexist naturally. So, Ashish, given that resonating title, Intimate Enemy, I mean, such exquisiteness of expression arises out of a real struggle with language and thought, which resonates throughout that book. But can I ask you, I've never asked you this before, how did you come up with that title, with that expression, which has become a bon mot? It's now of the kind of title that you have, The Wretched of the Earth, M.S. Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, one of the classics of anti-colonial thought. But the title itself has a lot to do with that resonance. Can I ask you?
Intimate Enemy.
Intimate Enemy.
Well, first of all, I must thank you for this lovely introduction. I wish my wife was here. I find it very difficult to convince her of what to say. A minor correction, I call myself an intellectual street fighter. I don't deal in certitudes. And my aim is to break certitudes. Because we live in a world which we have tried to invest with certitudes which it no longer can cope with. Our vision in that sense is limited by our search for certitudes, because human beings love to live with certainties. And this world is not a world of certitudes. But anyway, I shall come to that later. The title came because I deal in continuities. I do not deal with disjunctions. The contemporary world loves disjunctions. You are a great creative writer, painter, or thinker if you have introduced a break in the culture of arts. That is the definition of the new. But there is another language which is spoken by people outside our domain, who are not that much exposed to the modern world. I mean, it's a bit like, to the modern sector, one could give the example of, say, one of the great artists of Renaissance. if you told Michelangelo that he is a great creative artist, he would have been a bit surprised, because his self-conception was that of a person through which art is created. He was blessed. He was blessed, and his art reflected sources within him which are larger than him. In his time, it would have been divinity. Our times, it has other names. But there is this element of difference between earlier creative functionaries and contemporary world. Now, I wanted to draw attention to the fact in this instance that there was a continuity between those who ruled us under colonialism and those who were being ruled. I wanted to draw attention to the fact that in the very act of resisting colonialism and fighting it, the greatest danger is this, that you might become in the process more and more like your enemies. I always believe that you can be casual about the choice of your friends, but you have to be very careful about the choice of your enemies. Because your enemy defines you after a point of time. If you are obsessed with your enemy, he begins to define you. The Israeli state is a very good example of that. It was supposed to be a state of the oppressed. But in the process of building that state, gradually there emerged a hardened version of identity of Israeli citizens and Jewish culture as a whole, where you became yourself oppressors. There's a lovely book by Mahmoud Mamdani on the Rwandan genocide, which has a title something like Victims Can Be Killers. And that I had, I know that is more recent, but I had something of that kind in mind. And I do think colonialism was a joint venture. And that is why I have come to feel that the most dangerous form of colonialism was the colonialism which began when the South Asian countries became independent, because the structure that we developed in very neatly replicated the colonial concept of the state, colonial concept of relationship between the citizen and the state, the concept of law and order, the concept of what should be the values of public life, and so on and so forth. And that's, I think, is the greater tragedy, because in some sense, we have become like that. If you look at the contest between China and India for agricultural land in Africa, you will find that there's, in many ways there are great similarities. Our model basically is the 19th century nation state. India and China today are the only two 19th century nation states left in the world. And which is, both of them are quite close to a success in that venture. And that is my fear. I don't want that success. I don't want India to be a superpower. I want India to be a more human state, more compassionate state, more empathic a state with a concept of empathy somewhere built into it, which is a contradiction in term. A state shouldn't have this kind of quality. State is not a person, it is an impersonal entity. But I would like to see it reflect some of the capacities that are within the people of this region. And this region, despite our experiences, has fantastic potentialities. I have faith in the people. I have faith in the citizens of not only India, but the whole of South Asia. I think it's a betrayal of that citizenry when we talk of social engineering as if they are subjects in a laboratory on whom you foist new concepts of citizenship, new concept of human values, new concepts of social relationships. I do believe there are potentialities waiting to be unleashed. For the last 15 years, I have been studying genocide, mainly the one which took place at the time of partition of India. I must say that it has changed me. I have learned more from the victims and also the few killers we have got, because I did the study 50 years after the event. By that time, given the life expectancy in this part of the world, 90% of the people who could have stood witness to the events were dead. I wish my elders had done the job for me. But nobody has done the way I would have liked it to be done, so I have been engaged in the study. And some of the findings are remarkable. I will just give you one example. I don't want to monopolize this conversation. We interviewed 1,500 people. And one of the questions we asked him, did you, during those days, many of the victims are bitterly anti-Muslim, most of them are Indians. Many of them are most of them are bitterly anti-Muslim. They remember with great bitterness what happened to them, how they were driven out like cattle out of West Part, Punjab mainly. So one of the questions we asked them was, did you ever receive any help from any Muslim, or in the case of Muslim, Hindus, or heard of such help being given to people like you? 40% of those interviewed said, yes. I defy you to produce any data from any genocide anywhere in the world where this figure will be even cross 4%. And that's what we are capable of. That's what we are capable of. That even the victims who are so bitterly anti-Muslim say that they have received help. We later found out, for instance, why some of the reasons why they don't want to often own it up. Because they have, but they own it up also. And this even in the case of some of the die-hard killers. That also I must point out to you. These capacities exist here. The Taliban or the riot experts of India, they are not the last word in social relations or intercommunal relations. And if you think our data pertains only to India, let me point out that Salim Ahmed collected data and had more than 100 case studies in Pakistan of Muslims who had been similarly held by Hindus when they were running away from India as victims. And some of them are very moving. I have reasons to be proud of them.
Yes. This point really allows me to get at the heart of one of the criticisms that has been made of your work, what you are calling faith in the people, right? And this faith that you have in civilization, in our civilization, and its potentialities. I have two questions about that. The first one is not really a question for me personally, because I think a lot of the misunderstanding comes from the fact that people are simply not able to see bourgeois. We are talking about middle class people, of course. That's one of the main people who you address, obviously, since that is it is civil society that you write for, right? They cannot, in the public sphere, in civil society, the violence of the modern world is not really visible. It's constantly hidden in various kinds of ways through concepts as well, through the kind of discourse that exists, which you have done so much to point out, right? So part of that civilizational potentiality is obscured by the sheer dominance of the narrative of progress, etc. Right? But the other question that I have is, given the brutal instrument that is the modern state and its unprecedented capacity to penetrate society, even if there existed at the time of partition such civilizational potentialities, are they still present today? Sorry, I've got a cough. Are those potentialities still present today? Are they not being drained quite rapidly, given the increasing penetration of our societies, of our cultures?
Yes, we are getting brutalized. We are becoming proper nation states more and more. We are becoming nationalists. Yes. But if you ask me whether the potentialities are getting blunted or eroded, I just cannot agree with that. It might have been blunted. It might have been rendered slightly important. Listen, but it exists. You are a Pakistani. I mean, I would ask you, this is a predominantly Pakistani crowd.
Right.
I will ask them, how many of you know or remember? You all know, but do not want to know, that Pakistan has brought down 4 army regimes, relatively non-violently, through street demonstrations.
Right.
That's a world record. It ought to go in Guinness Book of Records.
Right.
It ought to go in Guinness Book of Records. It doesn't go. Nepal brought down a 700-year-old monarchy in a democracy movement which lasted less than 14 days. The first movement I'm talking about. Relatively bloodlessly. That also deserves to go in the Guinness Book of Records. The shortest democracy movement ever. But I don't think most Nepalis even think of it that way. We are not accustomed to look at our strengths. We are not accustomed to look what we are capable of. And that is why this always becomes a tug of war between the moderns amongst us, who think that we are entering, I mean, they might criticize the Islamic right all the while, but they talk as if we are stuck in the age of Zaliyat and emerging from it, crawling out of dark ages. Even we have learned from the West to call our Middle Ages dark ages.
Yes.
Medievalism, that's a term of contempt. That's a term of abuse. Yes. I mean, I think medieval age in India was the golden age of India. And people here and there did recognize that. Both Tagore and Gandhi, two of the greatest sons of India, both pointed out that Indian unity is not based on the classical texts of Vedas and Upanishads. It was based on the medieval tradition of religiosity, the medieval tradition of more ambiguous, open-ended identity of selves, of people like Nanak, Kabir, all the way down to Lalan, and the whole rest of them. And yet, we think that we have to go back to the classics. We have to go back to the Upanishads or Vedas or Quran, because that will give us a single identity, and a tough, clear, negotiable identity, because that's what the modern nation state deserves. You must have a nation. This, it's interesting that Tagore used at least 15 Bengali words for patriotism. From Desha Prem to Swadesh Chinta and so on and so forth. 15 of them in Bengali. But whenever it came to nationalism, he used English word nation and nationalism. because nationalism is qualitatively different from patriotism. Patriotism is a form of territoriality. Even cats and dogs have it. Even birds have it. They go back to their homes. That's what we used for sending messages through pigeons. But nationalism is a theory. It has a well-defined ideas of the enemy and the ally. It has clear-cut ideas of how to define yourself as a community. You are a Pakistani first, then a Muslim or a Hindu or a Christian or whatever. In India also, they are all the way saying that. You know? I mean, these are 5,000-year-old identities. How can they yield priority to a nation state, which is hardly 65 years old? This is natural that other identities will emerge. I think Mughal Empire did much better because it never made these absurd claims that you are first a citizen of Mughal India Empire and then other things. I mean, it said, all right, whenever the need for the country comes, you fight. And when it comes to other things, you live with other priorities. It should be a shifting hierarchy. Once again, a more open-ended approach. The Mughal state, for instance, had this remarkable capacity of allowing different entities to have different levels of relationship with the center. Which would any of the South Asian states do that? It's unthinkable. We have taken the model, 19th century model, we have not borrowed it. We have swallowed it hook, line and sinker.
Yes. It's absolutely true that the medieval polity had a much more layered sense of sovereignty, and the question of being a citizen of the Mughal Empire simply did not arise, of course, because one cannot be citizen of a monarchical state, right? So even monarchies today in our world will somehow have to claim to be expressions of the people. But to give an example from the Ancien regime in Europe, so famously, Louis XVI said, "L'État c'est moi," the state is me. So the Mughal king did not claim to represent the people. So there's that one major difference that existed. But the question that I have is that political past available in any productive way to us today? So
I'm not pleading for return to the past.
Right.
The past is past. I am talking of the way we could have picked up elements of our past to be used more creatively in the contemporary context. We are living in the present. We are living in the present. But we have got stuck in that idea of a historically defined stages of growth. So we cannot. And now the only legitimate ancestors are now the Greeks, because the Greeks had enlightenment values, or were congruent with that. I mean, the Greeks also had other traditions which Europe had not heard of, because the Greeks never had any connection with West Europe and America was not discovered. The Greeks had connection with Persia, Egypt, India, and God-forsaken Afghanistan. That's what the Greeks were in touch with. But our conversation with them had no value. I mean, they have become the ancestors of the Europeans.
Right.
So we have suffering from an ancestor envy.
Yes.
Now, so we cannot, we borrow from our past. But I am not telling you to borrow from the past. I am even telling you to get inspired by certain themes, certain ideas, certain specks of wisdom there were. That is where. And use it in contemporary world more creatively. Think for yourself. That is possible, at least.
Yes.
That is at least possible.
Yes.
And we have not. We want a pristine, pure 19th century European nation state, because that will only undo our humiliation in the hands of Europe. That's their attitude.
Yes, actually, this formulation reminds me one of the qualities of your writing, right, is the kind of abyssal experience that one has while reading you, right? Because it doesn't come, your thought does not come from some kind of theory, really, but it is really the groundless ground of experience, right, from which thought emerges in your work. Now, in terms of experience, it seems to me that the civilizational past that you are talking about and you think is, in fact, you do think that it is still available. It is available at the level of experience, at the level of practice of the large majority of our population, right, in your writings, right, and not at the level of the middle classes or civil society or the public sphere. So if you want to look for that continually available past that you are talking about, right, it is really at the level of the popular or the folk. Isn't that correct?
Yes, you are probably right there. India at the moment, to give you a very concrete example, India at the moment is facing what India's Prime Minister says the greatest threat to the Indian state, namely a Maoist movement. The movement is confined entirely to the tribals. They call them tribals, but actually indigenous people you can also call them. I don't care for names. It's very clear that they constitute probably not less than 98% of the people in this Maoist movement. And I can assure you, out of this 98%, at least 97% have never heard of the name of Mao and cannot spell it.
Yes.
Now, because we call them Maoists, the only solution to the problem is seen as the law and order machinery. Yet, their real grievance is this, that their life support system is under threat and has been so for 65 years, despite all promises to the contrary and despite even quite sympathetic legislation. This, our constitution has been subverted to subvert their lifestyles, their life support systems. And now when they have rebelled, and some sympathetic urban youth have joined them because they have come from this Maoist position, we would like to define them as threats to the state, as dangerous lunatics who have rebelled and who deserve to be killed like so many flies. I think this is obscene. This is vulgar. This is all over the place. I know people feel very strongly about the tribal population here nowadays because they have produced the Taliban. But I always give the example that the same tribals who have produced the Taliban had produced a 100,000 strong force of resistance against British Empire, who were totally non-violent, total commitment to non-violence. The British police and paramilitary forces were particularly nasty with the Pathans because they had fought 4 Afghan wars without really winning Afghanistan. So they were particularly nasty, treated very badly, and yet not one Pathan picked up a stick to hit back. I think that also shows some potentiality. The Taliban is not the last word. I mean, if one superpower infiltrated Afghanistan and occupied it, and the other then mobilized this Taliban to fight them, and in the process brutalize them, if they have, through sheer concern for realpolitik and Cold War politics, turned Afghanistan to what it is today, a pale shadow, a ruins of its own self, I think that is a tragedy at least we should have some sensitivity too. And even the pathology of the Taliban cannot be traced only to something like an original sin. It was created. Taliban was created. The pathological form of Taliban was created. And we are paying for that. That also was an imperial enterprise, which has other fallouts. We have lost this sensitivity. We have lost this sensitivity. And to me, it's a great tragedy that what could have been our strength has been turned into our weaknesses.
Thank you so much for that. It's really very significant to say this because the fact of the matter is that the prejudice against Pathans in Pakistan itself, right, amongst the middle classes again, not amongst the popular classes, that's a very complicated thing to get into, but certainly the larger discourse is extremely racist against the Pathans. I mean, and it's indebted really to this ideology that the British invented after 1857, which was the martial races of India, right? So it's basically a discursive conception which has very little relationship to experience or tradition or history or anything like that. It's just a priori true that the Pathans are a martial people, etc. And yes, that is very much our colonial inheritance. But I want to get to another critical question about populism, right? So one of the results, to my mind, is this new politics of corruption, or the new discourse of corruption, which more and more dominates politics, right, in the post-liberalization period in India and also here in Pakistan. So the direct political manifestation of this is, on the one hand, in India, the Aam Aadmi Party, and here in Pakistan, the PTI, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, Imran Khan's party. Now, to my mind, the politics of corruption, which is very, very populist, and some of your own colleagues from CSDS have supported and joined the Aam Aadmi Party, right? So, but it seems to me, and it's even more stark here, that the politics, which is a populist politics of corruption that is emerging over here, right, is in fact based on the idea that there is an outside to the corruption that is not just part of the system, some kind of epiphenomenon, but really systematic throughout. So isn't there this danger in the kind of in populism, right, that it can lead to a kind of fascist politics, which we are seeing more and more?
Yes, I mean, I know I don't have to point out to you that the world's only truly zero corruption society is Singapore. It may not be a fascist state, but not very far away from that either. It's a police state, straight away.
Right.
Let me put it more mildly. So many Indians who think of zero corruption do not like my saying that. But I don't mind saying that I would not like India to become a zero corruption society, nor any of the South Asian countries for that matter. We should have a small amount of corruption, because a lot of corruption are paid by people who are at the margin of desperation for various reasons. Even some of the big fishes are of that kind. Like, for example, in India there has been a drastic, radical change in the power system. Power is now shared by people from the bottom of the society. Mayawati is a good example. India's largest state is ruled by a former untouchable. Half the Indian states, no upper caste or no part of the traditional elite can ever hope to head, because those half the states already have had this lower caste and scheduled caste and tribals and OBCs ruling for the last 30, 40 years. Now, many of these people have used politics as a way of climbing the social ladder. And they have no other instrument to protect their position except politics. So they have to win at any cost. And the corruption is often a way of securing their future, knowing that politics is a very uncertain game. You win elections, but you also lose elections. So you want to secure the future of not only yourself, but your children and grandchildren, perhaps your clan, entire clan. And that gives a touch of desperation to the kind of corruption they indulge in. I may not be sympathetic really for their corruption, but I am willing to wink at their corruption once in a while. I mean, I will give you an example. Mr. Narasimha Rao, the former Prime Minister, maintained his majority in the parliament by buying 6 MPs. It's a good investment. Huh? You can buy some MPs of your country. It pays you very rich dividends in the long run. He purchased 6 MPs. All happened to be, this is revealing, all happened to be from the bottom of the society. Tribals and lower caste, untouchables. Now, they were given the money by the Prime Minister. So they felt perfectly secure. And all the 6 made foolish purchases and foolish investments which could be immediately traced. For example, India, there is a rule that if you buy a car entirely in cash, that has to be reported to the tax, sell tax, tax authorities, the revenue department. One person went with the money Narasimha Rao Congress party gave him and purchased a flat in cash. That also, he was supposed to report it. One purchased a car. One opened a safe deposit vault and kept the cash right there in the bank. All were caught. And Mr. Narasimha Rao himself was convicted. That's a different story. Now, I do not endorse the corruption, but I understand the stupidity of this. Instead of giving to this, instead of spending the cash, if they had given these experts who can launder such money for you at a minor cost, they would have all gone scot-free. I mean, within 3 days, the money would have vanished. Madhu Koda, the tribal chief minister, did a fantastic job just because he employed somebody to do the main investment for him. Instead of going to the standard places of investment like Switzerland or the Isle of Man and so on and so forth, well-known places, his man chose countries which nobody has thought of. No tax evader had thought of. Made investment in Romania, Ecuador and San Salvador, that kind of countries. Nobody thinks of inquiring there. And he survived for a long while. It is only accidentally he was caught. He is the unofficial billionaire of Indian politics, Mr. Sharad Pawar being the only other one. Nobody has ever caught him. But that's the way it goes. So there is this part of the story on corruption, which we should be at least aware of.
Thank you, Ashish. I think now we should open the floor for questions from the audience. Who would like to ask a question? Yes, sir. The older gentleman. Yes.
My name is Saeed Hassan Khan. I write on the Indo-Pak problems. It's more a comment than the question. You mentioned that you interviewed people who were affected by the riots in 1947, and a lot of people said that they were held by the other community there. But I am a witness something very fantastic in 1955 in Lahore. Lahore was populated by at least 50% of refugees from Amritsar who have suffered. Visa restrictions were waived and 10,000 Indians arrived in Lahore. And they were often refused, that shopkeepers didn't want their money, the milkman will sell the milk without money, Tanga people refused to take the fare, and they were entertained like this. Within 5 years, people have forgotten what had happened, and they were open-heartedly received. The same thing happened when we went to Jalandhar and Amritsar. The only interesting and amusing event was that I was sitting outside a restaurant where a Sikh was completely drunk and happy, but he was regretting that he was refused entry at the house of a lady of night.
Right. Ashish. So. Any other questions? That lady there.
उधर ही है।
Okay. Hello. Would you like to ask first? Okay. My name is Nagira Rahman, and I would like to revisit what you said about the relationship between the ruled and the rulers. In 2011, you mentioned visiting a Holocaust museum in Los Angeles where the Nazis had created a museum of what they thought would be the extinct Jewish race. My question over here is, do you have any measures for suggesting how we can resist or at least survive more subtle forms of cultural invasion? For example, when there are corporate endorsements of things which, where corporations really don't have a role, for example? That's my question.
I didn't get it quite. Can you please spell it out?
Yes, my question is, basically, when we speak about colonialism, it was quite overt. The enemy and, the outsider was quite clearly identified. But what do you do when that relationship, when you actually do become more like your enemy? If we are already a society that is in danger of becoming that, how do we step back?
That's a difficult question to answer. And that I say it's so difficult because my suspicion is this: we didn't study this because we didn't expect this. In the case of the partition, in the few cases where I had interviewed people from different generations, I found that the actual victims were less hostile to Muslims than their children and grandchildren. And my suspicion is this, that the children and grandchildren get a packaged story about partition and its violence, whereas the actual victims, their parents, have a more rounded picture in their mind because they have lived in a Muslim majority society and a Muslim majority community for years. So there is that part of the story too. And that's why I'm saying it's a complicated question. Yes, it is further complicated by the fact that I have found, because this last 15 years I have been studying genocides and I have gone into the case of genocide very systematically in many other countries too, that the cruelest, most gruesome stories of violence come not from places where the two contending communities were strangers, but where the two communities were very close to each other. This is a very strange thing, that when two communities are very closely intertwined, when that relationship for some reason snaps, it takes horrendous forms. Because it is almost like an exorcism, that they are a part of you and you are a part of them, and you are trying to exorcise a part of you, which like a ghost. Like a ghost. You are trying to exorcise that part of yourself. And you can be very cruel, very ruthless, and very particularly very cruel, frankly, in that situation. That happened in Punjab, that happened in Bengal. Do not forget that the riots did not touch many other parts of the country where they could have taken place. Did not. Because perhaps this intertwining of community had gone close in Punjab for a very long time. In Punjab, it took particularly gruesome forms.
Right. We have time for one more question. And that lady has been asking for a while, so I'll give it to her.
Bela Jamil, Idara Talim Agai and coordinator for the South Asia Forum for Education Development. Very inspiring conversation. A question that when we have now the 19th century nation state clearly in trouble, and we also have a panicked state or states, and we have responses like this and your work by society, where is this going to be only event-based and book-based, or are we going to see society come together and rise to the occasion, because clearly the state cannot? Do you have any evidence of that, or do you
Yes.
see any hope?
I see evidence, none of them heroic, none of them grand, none of them dramatic, but I do see evidence all around me. I see this, that the younger people are much less burdened by the past. They don't want to be burdened. And many of them are burdened out of design. They think that if they raise these issues, they will give it some mileage in politics. So there is that part of the story. But nonetheless, the newer generations care two hoots for the ghosts which haunt their elders. And I'm afraid in South Asia, we will see a reaffirmation of its traditional ways of living, where even, I might also say, I'm not a believer, but I must say even religion will have a different kind of space, because South Asian religions are different. All religions have a different tenor to it. You see some of it in Southeast Asia, but it is in many ways unique. Because each of them have lived with enormous diversities for centuries, I should say millennia. And that is the natural way to live. I have even come across BJP functionaries who use these riots as totally instrumental. I shouldn't take names, but I will take nonetheless. I know there is in our parliament one Obaisi chap in Indian parliament. His father was a riot expert. वो हैदराबाद में चार मीनार के पास जो riot होता था, वो ओवैसी साहब वो riot जमाते थे. He was an expert on those riots. And in Hyderabad itself, there was one Mr. Sheshadri who was a riot expert of BJP. So much so that when we were studying the demolition of the Babri Mosque thing, some of the volunteers of this Shiv Sena and RSS and others told us that there will be a riot. And when we asked why do you say so, how do you know? They said, Sheshadri साहब आए हैं, तो riot ही होने वाला है ना? He was a riot expert. I was astonished to find later on that Sheshadri and Owaisi were great friends, and every fortnight met once for a lunch or dinner together. Riots are necessary for the hoi polloi. Those who organize them, they think about it and plan them, may be doing so very instrumentally. And that is the difference between partisan violence and much of the riots that have come in. Because recent riots in India are all planned like a chartered accountant plans investment portfolios. Who will gain from the riot, how, which way, and so on and so forth. And even the recent one at Muzaffarnagar in UP is a copybook example of that. All four parties were involved in it, including the parties which supposed to speak for Muslims, because they were afraid their votes were going away. a minor riot they thought would help them to detain them. Particularly, they were nervous because Narendra Modi was making gestures towards the Muslims in his new incarnation as a Muslim lover. That's the way it goes. And so there are many levels in human nature. He gave me an impression in my introduction that I have written on a lot of subjects. I have not written on a lot of, I have written on very few subjects. I am basically remain a person who is interested how human beings tick, how individuals tick, how they make a sense of the world, that kind of thing. That's very narrow psychological perspective. It looks different, but because I am seeing it under different context. And my reading of this is this, that human beings operate at many levels. When I said that some of the victims of riots, after 50 years, remember it with great warmth, it includes Madan Lal Pawar, who was a Hindu refugee from Punjab. He was so bitter that he got involved in the assassination of Gandhi. He was part of the group of 6 persons, or 7 or 8 persons, who conspired to kill Gandhi. He threw the first bomb at Gandhi's prayer meeting and was caught. And he served a life term because he was part of the conspiracy. Lifetime, 18 years he was in jail. I interviewed him in his old age. And it was remarkable. He started with very bitter harangues about Muslims and Gandhi. He called that bastard wanted to be a Muslim peer. We had to kill them for the safety of Indian state. This language of the state, is very important how that language is used. And, the harangue went on. But gradually, as we interviewed him, another man emerges. He remembered with great fondness, after abusing the Muslims, great fondness. What was his most fond memories? It was his childhood in Montgomery, district Montgomery, at Pakpattan, where Baba Farid's mausoleum is there. And those fair that they had it there. And the Qawwals who came there. And he even sang out in a tremulous old man's voice what some of the Qawwals sang. And he said, ऐसे तो मुसलमान तो खराब नहीं थे, अच्छे ही थे. उस वक्त कुछ हो गया. So, I am a humanist now. This is not the only case. I can give you many such instances. So people have many layers of living. You can say that whom he killed, because he killed a lot of Muslims. Before Gandhi, he killed Muslims in Hyderabad, Gwalior and Bombay. So he has a record of killings. I am not denying that. And those who are dead are not likely to derive consolation from the fact that in last years he has become a humanist. I am not pushing that point. I am saying people have many layers. And it is very difficult to make a summary judgment the way most of us are prone to do. There is a world outside waiting to be confronted and even used.
Thank you so much, Ashish, and thank you so much to the audience. We've now run out of time. Thank you very much.